For today's video, we will be looking at Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. Did it live up to its Metroidvania expectations, or did it fall flat? Well, as someone who put in a lot of time with this game, I can certainly say that I personally enjoyed it. Bloodstained Ritual of the Night was a game developed by ArtPlay Studios and published by 505 Games. It released June 18th, 2019. Producer Koji Igarashi, known largely as Iga, is well known for his work on the Castlevania franchise. He was a programmer, writer, and assistant director for Castlevania Symphony of the Night, one of the highest regarded games in the franchise. His role in this game led him to be transitioned into the lead producer on many following Castlevania titles, all the way from Area of Sorrow on the Game Boy Advance to Dawn of Sorrow, its sequel. After working on these games for quite some time, he eventually decided to leave Konami, and given Konami's track record, it's probably no surprise why. He then co-founded ArtPlay, his own development company, and used Kickstarter to acquire his initial funding. The Kickstarter was an astounding success, reaching its base goal within 4 hours and hitting 1.5 mil on the first day. They even had a goal to get specific voice actors on board, and they managed to get David Hayter, the voice actor for Solid Snake, on board with this. With the corporate elites at Konami no longer dragging Iga down, he was allowed to pursue his own creative vision. Thus, we are presented with Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. Bloodstained is a 2D Metroidvania that takes a lot of inspiration from its Castlevania predecessors. And by a lot of inspiration, I mean quite a lot of inspiration. Iga essentially copied his old homework, but just changed the title a little so the teacher didn't know that he copied it. This is a pretty common tactic in the programming world. If you know that your code is going to be repeated in another project, you can just simply copy-paste it and then update some of the terms and variables for your new project. Iga did essentially this with Bloodstained. This is almost immediately apparent whenever you look at some of the enemies that the game offers. Many of these are just straight up ripped from the Castlevania franchise. Now, depending on who you ask, this could be seen as a good or bad thing. Many of the dedicated fans that have been craving a new Castlevania experience are completely fine with some of these issues, while others might take annoyance with the fact that he did copy so much. Even with some of this blatant copying, the game still offers a fresh experience. The core of the game tasks you with controlling Miriam, your main character, as you navigate the inner sanctum of this castle. Within the castle, there are several types of demons present and different traps and obstacles that you must overcome. The castle itself is just ginormous and presents to you a variety of environments and locations that you can explore. As per the Metroidvania experience, this exploration will net you with unique power-ups and abilities that allow you to bypass older obstacles and make traversing/navigating the castle a lot easier. In terms of story, the game doesn't really put a huge focus on it. It gives you a pretty typical revenge story for your main antagonist, and you are tasked with stopping him. Fearing irrelevancy during the Industrial Revolution, alchemists began researching demon summoning and human transmutation to give humans demonic powers. Not unlike Full Metal Alchemist, this didn't really go very well. In an attempt to scare off the new technology, they sacrificed humans in order to summon demons. And as demon summoning goes, bad things started to happen, and they couldn't control them. Go figure. Just before the sacrificial ritual, fortunately for our main character, she ended up falling to a mysterious slumber before this entire sacrifice ended up happening. Our main antagonist, Jeeble, was also part of this ritual and ended up surviving even though the rest of the humans were dead. Jeeble now of course seeks revenge on the human race and wants to annihilate all of them, because you know, they did me wrong, I wipe out the planet. It's just logic, right? 10 years later, he begins to enact on this desire and summons a giant demon castle to end humanity. As this happens, Miriam ends up awaking from her slumber, and per a childhood promise to stop each other, she ends up embarking to prevent Jeeble from, ending all of humanity. This is where our story takes place, and it is up to us to now navigate the castle, slay demons, become a god, one-shot the final boss, and save the day. Throughout the game, you'll be introduced to several RPG mechanics, there is loot and armor that you can equip to make yourself stronger. Additionally, you can also obtain the powers of defeated enemies. Very similar to Iga's previous work, Castlevania Aria of Sorrow, you can absorb the souls, or shards in this case, of the fallen demons. This will provide you a plethora of abilities to utilize as you navigate the castle. The range of effects is actually pretty diverse. Some abilities will allow you to transform your character completely, while others are simple projectile attacks that you can use to damage enemies. These shards are obtained at random and can actually cause some variety in different playthroughs for different people. This randomness will prove to be very effective as we talk about the Randomizer Mode later in the video. The weapons are also pretty cool in this game, and they actually have some Street Fighter-esque commands that allow you to unlock unique abilities. You can do this straight from the start of the game. You don't have to be told about them. If you know what they are, you can actually use them. There are bookshelves scattered throughout the castle that indicate what the unique abilities are for specific weapons, but I recommend just trying to use and spam quarter circle forward if you get a new weapon to see if it has something special. These commands will take up MP and will usually be a little bit stronger than just doing a basic attack. The only unfortunate thing is, it doesn't even pale in comparison to the power that magic has in this game. The one major gripe that I myself have with this game and some others in the community is that the magic is just incredibly overpowered. As you may be seeing from some of the gameplay footage, I'm running around one-shotting literally everything, including the bosses. It's not super uncommon for these types of games to turn you overpowered towards the end of the game, but I do kind of wish it was a little more balanced, especially on the game's harder difficulties. That being said, there's usually no reason to waste your MP on the abilities of the weapons when you have such a variety of super broken spells at your disposal. The one nice thing is, you can impose some self-restrictions on yourself and be like, I'm just not going to use magic, and make the game a little more challenging. I do approve totally of games giving you this kind of freedom to really choose how you wish to play, but I just kind of wish that the magic itself was a little more balanced because it's so much fun to use, and it can be a little demoralizing when you just run around and completely nuke rooms or even the bosses. Either way, the game is pretty fun, and there's a variety of game modes and other things for us to explore other than the base campaign. So let's talk about those. Due to the success of the Kickstarter, there were several stretch goals that were met. This included a lot of extra game modes. Some of the early game modes are pretty self-explanatory. Boss Rush mode and Speedrun mode are rather straightforward. Boss Rush mode is pretty much how it sounds. You select from 2 different courses, and then you go in and try to clobber the bosses as fast as you possibly can. The nice thing about this mode is it actually gives you some in-game resources for the save file that you use for this particular mode. Once you go in, you have to select which save file you wish to use, and you will be given the entire moveset and inventory of whatever that save file was. Once you complete your course, the file that you use to complete it with is then rewarded a special material that is used for unique upgrades and other things in the actual game itself. I personally like this aspect of it. It gives you an alternate way to grind some materials that can be a little bit fun and challenging if you want to push yourself to the limits and try to beat the bosses as fast as you possibly can. Or you can just pick your super overpowered one and one-shot them as we discussed in the previous one. As for the speedrun mode, that's also rather straightforward. In speedrun mode, you are given a timer in the bottom left-hand corner, and all of the cutscenes will be skipped immediately, with some of the animations also sped up. Unfortunately, the in-game timer is actually flawed, and therefore not used in the actual speedrun itself. At least this was the case when I last ran the game, and judging from some of the footage I watched of modern speedruns, I would say that it's still an issue that they have not fixed. The game is actually a pretty fun speed game, as there's a lot of movement and really fast tech that you can use to just speed and zoom through the castle. If speedrunning is something you might be interested in, I do recommend checking out the speed community for this game. I even have a tutorial on my channel around here for the category that I ran, New Game Plus, no major glitches. The tutorial itself is minorly outdated, but it's actually still a solid resource for the category. I actually got curious and went back to check my placing on the leaderboards, and my old runs are still rather relevant. I'm still in the 4th place spot. Even with new strats and some new techniques being found, my old runs still remain somewhat competitive, and I'm honestly pretty proud of that. Boss Revenge mode is essentially the boss rush mode, but in reverse. Instead of playing as the main characters, you now play as the bosses, and you go in and try to clobber the main characters. This is honestly a pretty neat concept, but the game mode does kind of come with some of its own problems. The main issue for me is that the boss's movement is pretty clunky, and it makes attacks really difficult to dodge. While I think I managed to get to the last phase, which I assume is Miriam, I never actually was able to beat it. For me, Bloodless was the most enjoyable to use, as she reflected Miriam the closest. Unfortunately, she lacks the same defensive mechanisms as Miriam, such as the slide or the backdash, making it still somewhat difficult to avoid attacks. But even still, it's much easier than with the large bodies that the other bosses have. I think it's pretty neat that they were able to provide special movesets for each of these bosses that the player themselves can use, but it's still kind of one of those, it's just an extra game mode to have some fun with. But I would certainly love to see this concept expanded upon. The next game mode is the Randomizer Mode. If you've kept up with old school / retro gaming, you may notice that this is a pretty popular thing that's been on the rise. Many of these retro communities have really popularized the randomizer movement, with the Zelda community kinda leading the way. Ocarina of Time and A Link to the Past being the 2 most popular randomizer communities out there. For those who may be unfamiliar, what a randomizer does is basically takes all of the items in the game, throws it into a single pool, randomizes them up, and then shoots them back out to where they're supposed to be in the base game. For an Ocarina of Time example, instead of getting the Kokiri sword in that early chest, maybe instead this time you're going to pick up the slingshot instead. This randomness can vary from very tame, with only a couple of items here and there, or to a complete chaotic mess, really making players have to constantly be on their toes thinking about how to progress the game. This can really put your game knowledge and critical thinking skills to the test. When you start up the mode, you are presented with a menu that allows you to toggle a variety of elements that influence the extremity of the randomness. Do you just want a tamer experience with a few items randomized, or do you want the full experience of the chaos and have everything randomized in the game? For recording purposes, I decided to throw everything in there, because I just wanted to see how crazy it could get. Recording footage for the randomizer was a ton of fun, and probably the most enjoyable aspect about returning to the game, at least for me. The random elements really added to the slight unfamiliarity I had with the game, so even though I put in a ton of hours in the past already, I was able to come back with a somewhat fresh experience. The final game mode of discussion is going to be the Classic mode. This game mode actually released in a mid-January update, making this the most recent mode added to the game. As the title suggests, this provides a more retro experience than the typical Metroidvania formula. As opposed to Castlevania Symphony of the Night, you're playing Castlevania 1, 2, 3 that were released for the Super Nintendo. Many people, including myself, thought that Bloodstained Curse of the Moon and Curse of the Moon 2 was going to be the retro experience that they promised for one of their backer campaigns. Instead, that turned out to just be kind of a side project, and they fully intended to release their own game mode for the Classic campaign. According to a YouTuber that I follow, some call me Johnny, who did a full video, this is very much one-to-one with Castlevania 1 for the Super Nintendo. As someone who never played that game, I can't really comment on whether or not that's true, but I can tell you that the actual gameplay feels very reminiscent to some of the Super Nintendo Castlevania games that I did play. This includes adding all of the bullshit that comes with those games. Very difficult platforming. Enemies are everywhere. There's direct knockback from taking damage, meaning you could potentially get knocked into pits all the time, which is definitely going to happen. There is a live system, so you could potentially game over and have to restart that particular level. Thankfully, it's not as bad as some of the older games where you have to restart an entire game or section. You just go back to the start of the level and no checkpoints. And there are sub-weapon overrides, which is probably one of the most frustrating. Sub-weapons, they drop from candles, and if you're playing this type of Castlevania experience, you're probably jumping around, slashing every candle that you possibly can, and you're just going to get your sub-weapon overrided when it turns out one of the candles contained a sub-weapon. All of these combined make it a somewhat difficult experience, but honestly, it doesn't actually end up being all that bad. I had a ton of fun with it, and they even added some of their own little flair to the game. There is this kind of backflippy jump that you can do if you hit the jump button twice, which is kind of neat and was pretty fun to experiment with. And there's this special electric attack that you can actually do with the whip that gives you a little bit of added damage. This game mode itself is probably the most separate experience from the base game, and therefore you can just jump into it whenever you want. This game mode is a fun side challenge to sink some playtime into, as long as you're not the throw your controller type of person. An exciting feature of some of the older Castlevania games that were on the Metroidvania style were the additional playable characters. Bloodstained Ritual of the Night follows this trend and gives us 2 playable characters. I do think that they have already announced that they intend to include 1 or 2 more characters, so we can expect to see even more, which I'm excited to see who they will choose. The first, and probably most obvious, additional playable character is Zangetsu, the tsundere edgelord weeb samurai who, although tried to kill us, we still kinda love him anyway. He's got that typical stoic badass demeanor, and plenty of weaponry at his disposal to leave chaos and death and destruction in his wake as we navigate the castle. Zangetsu, unlike Miriam, starts with all of his abilities. This includes movement abilities, combat abilities, every single thing that you can hope to do with this character is unlocked from the very beginning. This makes playing as him kind of fun and enjoyable, but albeit leaves a little bit to be desired when it comes to the overall experience of this play session. They also took out a lot of the RPG elements that existed in Miriam's playthrough. You simply got your awesome sword, some kunai, elemental buffs, and that's about it. There's no weapons that you can collect, no armor to collect, and you're pretty much on your own from there. While this is to be expected from the additional characters, it can be a little disappointing that the other areas of the castle are now no longer really necessary. All of those additional rooms are now completely useless and empty, as there's nothing there to collect that Zangetsu would use. You can still expect to find the HP and MP upgrades, but odds are you probably already know where they are, as this is intended to be a second playthrough of the game. Additionally, some of these RPG elements being gone also makes the run-through a lot more difficult. When it comes to Miriam's playthrough, you're able to purchase and craft HP replenishing items, but for Zangetsu, those do not exist. The only way to replenish your health is to go to a save point or to collect the HP upgrades. This actually can make some of the extended sections of the game a little bit more difficult, as you kind of have to run through with a single HP bar. Towards the end, this actually made the final boss a little more challenging as well, especially if you're playing on the harder difficulties. But aside from that, Zangetsu is stupid strong. He is probably the best boss killer in the entire game. He's pretty much set up and designed exclusively for that. All of his combat abilities just melt through the boss's HP bars. This is especially true for most of the early game bosses that will likely just go in one shot. The main gimmick of the Zangetsu playthrough is his elemental buffs. Zangetsu can buff his sword and his kunai with one of 3 elements: fire, ice, and lightning. These buffs will give you some nice visual differences in most of Zangetsu's special abilities and his kunai, but for the most part, we only really care about damage. And well, the fire one is the go-to one. Unfortunately, the fire just outclasses the ice and lightning to such a large degree, with the ice element being the worst out of the 3. The lightning element does have some niche uses, as whenever you use the kunai for it, it gives you these vertical pillars of lightning, which can be more effective than the fire counterpart. However, the ice just doesn't really have much going for it. It's got this neat little kind of line travel thingy whenever you use one of his special katana abilities, but aside from that, it's just kind of worthless. It's supposed to hit harder at face value, but fire just hits multiple times, so it ends up dealing a lot more damage, so it's just really not worth it. Aside from that, the rest of Zangetsu's abilities are pretty much there to make him move through the castle at blitzing speeds. His slide and his backdash are significantly faster than Miriam's, and he also has an additional ability that allows him to kind of phase through enemies as he passes them, leaving trails of fire in his wake. This can make navigating the castle with Zangetsu incredibly fun, and probably the most enjoyable part of his character. Bobbing and weaving and dashing through all of the enemies and hallways is just incredibly satisfying to pull off efficiently. In terms of the bosses themselves that he'll be facing, they are exactly 1-to-1 from the original game. This also includes the Zangetsu fights themselves, which is honestly kind of weird, but I guess it kind of works, defeat your inner demon, I guess. For the second Zangetsu fight, this is actually a lot of fun, and probably my favorite fight out of the entire Zangetsu playthrough. It really felt like this epic duel of the samurai, and even ended up being a fun challenge itself. That is, until I figured out a way to cheese the fights. As it turns out, one of Zangetsu's abilities is actually invincible, and therefore you can just kind of spam it infinitely until you run out of magic. Pretty much trivialize this whole fight. Even though I had some slight disappointments with Zangetsu's character, I can definitely say I enjoyed the playthrough. The speedrunner in me just couldn't allow me to hate the mode. The next playable character is Bloodless. What? Honestly, I gotta admit, I did not see this one coming. Out of all of the characters I thought they would include, Bloodless was definitely not one of them, especially since they had already placed her in the boss revenge mode. With that said, I probably enjoyed Bloodless more than Zangetsu's playthrough. I'm probably gonna get a lot of slack for that one. That's right, the crazy hot vampire waifu, which Bloodstained did before it was cool, turns out has the better of the 2 campaigns. The main reason for this is they actually changed things up for her campaign. You are still running through the same castle, but you actually start in Bloodless's boss fight room instead of on the ship. This small shakeup was much appreciated, and they even did some balance adjustments to kind of make up for the fact that you're starting in this location. The areas around her room are going to have enemies that are a little bit weaker than you would expect if you were playing through any of the other 2 campaigns. This makes things a little neat as you progress back to the ship because the enemies and boss there are much tougher than usual. Alongside of a new starting location, the much better improvement is you actually have collectibles that you can find if you explore the castle. You see, unlike Zangetsu, Bloodless doesn't start with all of her abilities. Scattered throughout are these shards that you have to collect in order to obtain those abilities and even some power-ups along the way. Most of her attacks and progression through the castle are going to be dependent on how many of these you can actually find. This makes Bloodless's campaign actually bring back some of those Metroidvania elements that were missing in Zangetsu's playthrough. For this reason, I actually enjoyed it a lot more. I was actually being rewarded for my exploration through the castle, and it made me want to go to these secret rooms and secret areas that I kinda just passed up with Zangetsu. Some of Bloodless's strongest abilities can actually be found in many of the more hidden areas of the castle. This means if you want the most DPS possible, you gotta go explore. You can expect to see pretty much all of the abilities that she used against you during her boss fight, and a couple of additional ones along the way. One of these additional abilities, which is actually inherent to her, is the ability to glide through the air using her parasol. This was pretty fun to actually use as you navigate the castle and kind of mix things up a little bit. Later on down the road, you'll actually gain the ability to deal damage with the parasol as you're gliding through the air, which I think adds a little bit of spiciness to the platforming and combat in a fun and unique way. Because of all of these factors, I actually ended up enjoying the Bloodless playthrough quite a lot. Her gameplay was fairly unique, and low-key would let her step on me, so...
Bloodstained.
So that's going to go ahead and wrap up today's video. If you enjoyed it, please drop below and leave a like. The algorithm likes that kind of stuff. And if you want to see more gaming content from me, please hit that subscribe button and the bell notification icon. Next up on the chopping block is going to be a lot of Nioh content. Nioh 2 content, I should specify. Nioh is a game that I'm a big fan of, and me and my friends have been long awaiting the PC release so that we can jump in and play a ton of that game. I'll definitely be reviewing the game, and I'll also be doing a lot of other content, maybe a couple of spicy builds or something, who knows. I just want to play it with some friends and have a good time. It's not going to be exclusive Nioh 2, but I will be doing that as the bulk of my content for the next few months, and so I can get my hands on a couple of other games I'm excited for, notably Phantasy Star New Genesis. If any of that interests you, feel free to follow the channel by hitting that subscribe button. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and sign off of here, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Later.